My name is Jason.
And my name is David.
And this is Discern Realities, a Dungeon World podcast. Listeners, this is the first of a special series we are doing called Dungeon World Basics. So, David, before we begin Dungeon World Basics, I thought it would be helpful for us to introduce ourselves, because I suspect there are going to be a lot of brand new listeners who may not be familiar with Discern Realities, who may not be familiar with the Gauntlet. How does that sound?
That sounds good. I see this project as a way for longtime listeners to share Dungeon World with people who may not know what Dungeon World is, and I think that's a good idea for us to let them know who we are and what we do.
Yeah, so Discern Realities is a production of The Gauntlet. The Gauntlet is an online gaming community, podcast network, and publisher. Our focus is independently published tabletop role-playing games. We host over 100 public game sessions per month. We organize an annual online gaming convention called Gauntlet Con. We produce 6 podcasts. This is one of them. And we publish a monthly zine called Codex. As for myself, I am one of the principal organizers of The Gauntlet. I co-host several of our shows, and I run games on Gauntlet Hangouts, which is our online gaming thing. And I am one of the editors of the Codex zine. David, introduce yourself, please.
So for me, in my involvement with the Gauntlet, I got started with it when it was a small organization that organized locally, and I have helped it grow where I can by being a part of podcasts, by helping editing in both podcasts and in our Codex zine. And I am occasionally running games for the Gauntlet as well.
Not as much as you used to. We need to get you back into it.
I am getting ready for that. So, why are we doing this?
What a fabulous question, David. Why are we doing the Dungeon World Basics series? You know, right now, Dungeons and Dragons is having a really big moment. It's really huge in the culture at this precise moment. And I think that some of the Dungeons and Dragons fans, the Dungeons and Dragons players and audience, I think they're going to eventually begin looking for different experiences. And so I thought it'd be interesting if we put something together to serve those people who might not be familiar with Dungeon World. This podcast, Discern Realities, has always been kind of produced with the assumption that listeners understand the basics of Dungeon World. And indeed, in many ways, Discern Realities is kind of like advanced Dungeon World, right? Because we talk about a lot of our own sort of custom procedures and homebrew things. Like we kind of said earlier, this series is being produced with a particular listener in mind. That is, a listener who understands the basics of Dungeons and Dragons and maybe understands or is familiar with other role-playing games, but who might just be learning about Dungeon World and other games that are powered by the apocalypse.
So specifically with this project, we're going to be following right along with the Dungeon World book. So we're going to be hitting the major headings and chapters as we work our way through this basic series. So if you have a book like that at home and you would like to follow along, this will be a great way to do it.
But not necessary at all. We're going to try to keep it like general enough and accessible enough to where you don't have to have the book in front of you. So.
Right. This does not assume that you have the book, but if you would like to, this will follow right along with it in organization. All right. So how will this affect our main Discern Realities feed for longtime listeners?
Great question. There will still be regular episodes, regular numbered episodes. Those episodes will continue to follow the normal format that our current listeners are familiar with. And so that's not going away. We expect the basic series to last around 12 to 15 episodes-ish. During that time, we will be producing fewer regular episodes. So this will be kind of interspersed, like the regular episodes and the basic episodes will be kind of interspersed with one another. Just sort of behind the curtain in a way. This is a really good move for David and I personally, listeners, because we've been doing the regular show for about 60 episodes now, and it's a great format. It's a format that's served us really well, and Discern Realities is indeed a pretty popular podcast. But I'm a little burned out. I'm not going to speak for David. I'm a little burned out, and I could use a different focus. I could use a chance to recharge my batteries. And I thought this basic series would be a great idea, especially considering that I think there are going to be a lot of people moving from D&D at some point looking for other things like Dungeon World.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this project. It's something that I've wanted to have out there for a while now, is something that new players can access, because I play a lot with new players, and I always tell them to listen to Discern Realities, but I always have to try and let them know which episodes in particular are going to be helpful for them. But now with this, I can tell them this is what you need to listen to.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. If you're a longtime listener of Discern Realities and you want to share the show with somebody, especially with somebody who doesn't know much about DW, this basic series is going to be great for that. So this is Dungeon World Basics. So let's start with the most basic of basic questions. David, what is Dungeon World?
Dungeon World it's a narrative-focused RPG written by Adam Cabal and Sage Latora. Its rules engine is what's called Powered by the Apocalypse, as opposed to like a traditional D20 system. What this means is that it uses the principles and ideas from a game called Apocalypse World by Vincent and Mackay Baker.
And sort of, and I'm not being flip here, in another way, Dungeon World is Dungeons and Dragons. And I'm not trying to blow anyone's mind here. This is what I mean by that. Dungeon World, at its core, is concerned with all the things that Dungeons and Dragons is concerned with. Character classes, adventuring parties, dungeons and other adventuring locations, monsters, spells, magic items, and so forth. It takes direct inspiration from older editions of Dungeons and Dragons and includes many concepts that will be familiar, such as the core stats, intelligence, strength, dexterity, all that. Alignment, the idea of character races, core classes like fighter, wizard, and thief, and things like that. And it also has kind of the same basic setup as Dungeons and Dragons, which is there is one participant who is the GM, which means game master, the equivalent of a dungeon master. They play the world and they present all the challenges to the player characters. Everybody else plays those player characters, and they're kind of responsible for playing their character and kind of looking out for their character's interests.
So if that's the case, why wouldn't folks just play D&D instead?
Well, because Dungeon World, there are many answers here, right? But Dungeon World has a lot of differences with D&D with regards to its actual gameplay. And, they might discover that they prefer those differences. We're going to be talking about many of those gameplay differences in this series, but the really big picture important thing here is that Dungeons and Dragons uses a lot of numbers and die rolls to determine what is happening in the story. Whereas Dungeon World, it also uses dice to determine certain story outcomes, but most of the power in Dungeon World lies in the words we are speaking at the table. In other words, we privilege our storytelling and narration in Dungeon World over numbers and dice rolls.
So what I hear you saying is that, and this is why I think why not just play D&D, is because it's more accessible. There's less of a cognitive load. Is that what I hear you saying?
I think that's part of it. I think it's a different kind of cognitive load, but it's definitely not a numbers heavy, stats heavy cognitive load for sure. You don't have to know great big lists of things.
Yeah. So I would say that's one big reason for me is its accessibility. And when I say accessibility, I don't just mean the cognitive load or the difference in cognitive load, but it's also financially more accessible. You will see that there are the core playbook or the core rulebook is less expensive than a D&D core book. And there's a giant community of creators that surround this game, creating all kinds of homebrew, free adventures, magic items, character classes, compendium classes, all out there to try out. And even those that are for pay, they're generally less expensive than traditional role-playing game products.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and also just kind of picking up on that point too, another reason you might want to try Dungeon World is it's accessible from a creation standpoint, right? Like it's really easy to tinker and create your own stuff for Dungeon World. And a lot of people love that part of it, like you said.
Yeah, it's dead easy to hack and homebrew. And that's why we originally created the Discern Realities podcast, was to share how we have been doing that.
So David, what is Dungeon World like to play?
So, like other role-playing games, you'll be sitting around a table or playing online like we do, and the core play is a conversation around what the characters are doing in the fiction. And the GM will generally lead this and point out things that are here and there, like problems and situations, and managing all the background material. And the GM is going to ask lots and lots of questions to facilitate the flow of conversation. So it's mostly just people talking about what's happening, but sometimes you're talking about the story in character, meaning through the eyes of the character that you are playing, or just describing their actions in the third or first person. Other times you're going to take a step back and not be behind your character's eyes and you'll talk about them in general. And it might turn into more like a writer's room type of a conversation. You'll share ideas that exist outside the fiction, meaning the characters in the story don't know about them. And then later you'll move back into the fiction, incorporating those ideas. Sometimes this can be important for sharing knowledge outside of the purview of the characters, but you want the players playing those characters to know so they can play into them.
Sometimes you do what's called framing up a scene. And what that means is someone, usually the GM, but not always, says where a scene is taking place, what's going on in the scene, and who is there. Players who have characters involved in the scene then kind of slip behind their character's eyes and have a conversation in character or describe what their character is doing. We talk to each other, like David said, we talk to each other in these different ways back and forth until something happens that triggers a move. Once a move is triggered, we read that move and then engage the relevant mechanics. And the outcomes of those mechanics often lead to the story going in a different direction. So let's talk about moves. David, give us just a bit of background on what moves are.
All right. So the concept of moves, as they're used in Dungeon World, comes from Apocalypse World, which we mentioned earlier by Vincent McGay Baker. And moves help us arbitrate moments in the story, usually moments where something is at stake or things can go wrong.
That's exactly right. And kind of a sort of a deeper take on moves, maybe a little bit beyond the scope of this conversation, but I think worth knowing, is that moves are also there to help us as players emulate genre. If we follow the directions of a move and roleplay the outcomes, we will be emulating whatever genre the game is trying to interrogate. So Dungeon World genre is a particular type of fantasy adventure story inspired by things like Lord of the Rings and the novels of Jack Vance. Going a little further, you can say that Dungeon World's genre is actually Dungeons and Dragons for the reasons we've mentioned before, because it does aim to recreate that very specific kind of D&D fantasy adventure experience. And so Dungeon World has moves such as hack and slash and spout lore and undertake a perilous journey. Those moves are the sorts of things you'd expect to happen in a Lord of the Rings, D&D-esque type fantasy thing.
So how do the moves work in play?
Well, there are many variations of move types, but most moves are structured in the following way. First, there is a fictional trigger. We don't really concern ourselves with the moves at all on the sheet until that fictional trigger is engaged. You can't do a move until you initiate the trigger in the fiction. So here's an example. The trigger for the Discern Realities move is when you closely study a situation or person. If, say, my character is spying on an encampment of orcs and I want to know more about what is going on with those orcs, I don't say, hey GM, I'd like to do Discern Realities on the orc camp. Instead, I describe what my character does, such as, I carefully move around the perimeter of the camp, staying hidden behind trees, and watch what the orcs are doing. That hits the trigger. It's another way of saying when you closely study a situation or person. Once the move is hit, most moves then have you do a roll. You normally roll plus a stat. That means you roll 2d6, 2 6-sided dice, add them up, and then you add your stat modifier. You then check the result with the text of the move. Most moves are structured like this. Now, mind you, this is a big caveat here because there's lots of different types of moves, but generally speaking, they go like this. On a 10 plus, you do the thing you were trying to do. On a 7 to 9, you do the thing you were trying to do, but there is some sort of complication or cost. On a 6 minus, or what we call a miss, sometimes that's defined in the text of the move, but more often than not, the GM actually gets to make a move of their own. Now, GM moves work a little differently, and we're going to cover that in a future episode. But just understand that basic structure for now. It's essentially success with complication, or GM move.
So why is this better than a traditional D&D style of move?
I think it's good. I wouldn't say necessarily better, because I do think that traditional D&D style type games, they're presenting a certain type of experience that a lot of people want. But we're talking about the experience that we want, right? And that we might want to have. And this is why I think that this procedure is good, why moves are great. For one thing, I think they're faster. In Dungeon World and in other games inspired by Apocalypse World, we don't care about moving from square to square on the map and then rolling dice for every little granular moment, right? Like rolling for every, swing of the sword, right? Moves operate on more of a scene level. They kind of pull back just a little bit, and they arbitrate like more fiction in total, right? So you kind of like do the move and then you kind of play out the fiction, and that encompasses lots of different things, right? So it's just a little bit faster. You can get a little bit more done. Also, there are no wasted moments. In Dungeons and Dragons, and indeed in most role-playing games, an action either succeeds or fails, right? It's very binary. You may roll a dice, you may roll dice, 4 or 5 times and like literally nothing happens, right? Like it's just a fail. Nothing happens. Nothing progresses the story. In Dungeon World, an action, either succeeds with a cost, or there's a twist or a complication that the GM introduces. In all cases, the story is moving forward and something interesting is happening.
Yeah, I agree. I think I want to put one finer point on something that you mentioned. This method of arbitrating any kind of perilous situation or any kind of information gathering through moves, it keeps you in the fiction more.
Absolutely. Hello. I have 2 very important things to share with you. The first, after a long wait, Codex back issues are now available on DriveThruRPG, so if you joined our Patreon late and missed some of the earlier issues, you can now round out your collection. The second, the newest issue of Codex, Codex Cold, is available in our Patreon feed through March 2018. Here's what you'll find inside. Firelight, an original powered by the Apocalypse game and Game Chef 2017 finalist. The Wreck of the Void Hatred, a chilling OSR scenario. Balia, which I may not be pronouncing correctly, but is in any case a rural town in Ireland from Monster Hearts 2. Our newest Gauntlet Daddy, Cold Cock. 5 dozen unusual things about the body we just found, a number of original illustrations, and a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey. To get Codex Cold, just make a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by March 31st. That's at patreon.com/gauntlet. And do check DriveThruRPG for the Codex back issues. Thank you. So listeners, we're going to do a little bit of actual play. David and I are. The goal with this little segment is to demonstrate some of the things we've been talking about. So I'm going to be the GM, and David is going to be playing a fighter named Lucero Castafiel. Longtime listeners of Discern Realities will recognize that name, especially the surname. Lucero Castafiel is a character who we did an actual play with in earlier episodes of Discern Realities, and we're kind of just picking up Lucero's story a little bit here. Let me give you the background here, listeners. So Lucero comes from a noble family called the Castafiels, and they are a family that is dealing with a really terrible curse. The curse is that Castafiels often, when they die, come back as vampires. There's a lot of ancient history there, and we're not going to get into it right now, but just know for now that many Castafiels, especially Castafiel women, come back as vampires. Lucero has learned that his sister, Urbina, has recently fallen and indeed was killed in the catacombs beneath a temple. This temple is called the Temple of the Peerless Star. Lucero has been traveling to the temple in order to go into the catacombs and retrieve his sister's body. Or, if she's a vampire, confirm that she's no longer there, or just basically figure out what's going on, because no one's heard from her in a while. So the last place we know she was in the catacombs beneath the Temple of the Peerless Star. Now, in the previous story, and I encourage folks to go find those in the feed if you want to know exactly what happened, Lucero was kind of journeying to this city where the temple is, and he suffered some pretty grievous injuries, right, David?
Yeah, that's right. He encountered a magician of sorts that managed to hamstring him with magic.
Yeah. And so a lot of the story that we've seen of Lucero to this point has been Lucero trying to recover, trying to go through the wilderness with this really terrible, I think it was a leg injury, right? This really terrible injury. And so where I think we're going to start the story here for this little actual play, David, is we're going to say that Lucero has been at the Temple of the Peerless Star for a number of days. I think his wounds are being treated by a young acolyte at the temple named Brother Andrew. I think he probably just showed up at the temple and said, "Hey, I need help," and they are helping him. I think that Brother Andrew has been tending your wounds over the last few days. You've been, maybe even weeks. You've been recovering, and you've become friends with Brother Andrew, right? And at some point, you explain to Brother Andrew why you're there, and he has agreed to help you. Now, the higher ups in the temple would not like for you to be poking around down in the catacombs, right? And indeed, Brother Andrew doesn't know much about the specifics of what's down in the catacombs himself. But he is going to help you get down there because he's taken a liking to you and he wants to help you find your sister, right? So I think we're going to begin the scene with Brother Andrew leading you down a long, twisty spiral staircase. He has a torch in his hand, and he's basically taking you down to the entrance of the catacombs. He's not going to be with you during this time. Once he's just going to let you do your thing and then leave. But in this moment, in the scene, we're going down there. Before we begin, I'd like to just get a quick snapshot of like what you look like. Like, how is Lucero dressed? What's his deal?
Lucero is not as neatly cut as when he set out on this journey as far as his clothing and his personal hygiene, but he has managed to get cleaned up with Andrew's help, and his clothes are getting a little bit more travel worn. He has a scarred face from being a fighter for a long time, but he was always meticulous about his clothes as a Castafiel is wont to be.
Yeah. So one thing about fighters is they have a signature weapon. What is Lucero's signature weapon?
Lucero's signature weapon is called Bloodless, and it's a chained weapon with bladed weapons kind of on either end connected by a chain. He's trained with it since he was young, and it is something that is passed down through the Castafiels.
Bloodless is a really interesting name for a hereditary weapon belonging to a family that is known for vampirism. Does the name Bloodless have something to do with the vampirism?
Yes, it does. It is partially made of silver, and it was originally purposed to bring down vampires who are weak to silver.
Nice.
Who might be referred to as the Bloodless, since they are pale and need to drink the blood of others.
Nice, I like it. Brother Andrew is pretty young. His duties are mostly to help people like you who show up at the temple doors, to clean, right? And he also studies the scriptures of the Peerless Star. The basics of their religion is there is this particularly magnificent yellow star in the sky that they believe is some sort of manifestation of a god or some sort of like physical representation of a god. And so they venerate it. Their divine magic is connected to it. They don't worship a particular god as such. They believe their power comes from this peerless star, whatever it is. And discovering the mysteries of this star is a big part of what they do. And they have high holy days that correspond to when the star is particularly bright in the sky.
Yeah.
But he's pretty young. I think he's wearing like the simple silvery blue robes of a brother of the Peerless Star. And he's got his little holy symbol around his neck, right? And he's got the torch in hand and he's kind of leading you down. And he says, Lucero, I want you to know that over the last few weeks that I have been assisting you and learning about you and your family's history. I've grown quite fond of you, and I hope you know that if something happens to you down here, I would be most distraught.
Nothing's going to happen down here, dear Andrew. We're beneath your temple. How dangerous could it possibly be?
And as you say this, he kind of like looks at you and gives like a small smile. But I think you see something on him that lets you know, like, he's really, really nervous and he's really scared for you. Like, what is about him physically that is a reminder of you're going into something kind of dangerous right now?
Yeah, I'm trying to ignore it and reassure him because I know this place is dangerous too. My sister disappeared down here and she was very capable. But his physical tell is this twitchiness that started around his eye with our first steps down here, but now is manifesting with even more. Like, he's like tapping on the walls and things like that and just twiddling his fingers. The deeper we get, the more manifestations of this twitchiness occur.
You get to the bottom of this stairway. There's a landing there, and there is a sort of kind of like a metal door. It is, well, let's say it's like a big heavy wooden door banded in metal. And he takes a heavy ring of keys off of his belt, and we hear the little clink, clink, and chunk, chunk as he unlocks the door. And he says, the first room there is mostly just storage. There's not much to it. There are 2 passages, one leading to the north and one leading to the east. The corridor to the east is quite short, and your sister is not there. I myself have been down in that direction and have seen nothing like that. The northern corridor, the one that goes to the north, it splits off in different directions and goes quite deep underground, actually. I suspect that's where you're going to find her.
Thank you, Andrew. You've helped me a great deal, more than I deserve for knowing you for as little time as I can. You truly are a generous faith.
And he kind of like clasps you on the shoulder and just gives you a little squeeze on the shoulder and smiles and says, I have to get back to my duties. And then he puts a torch in your hand, and he's just going to go up in darkness.
Yeah.
So you step into this room. It's a large circular room. There is a door on one portion of the circular wall. We'll say that he kind of was really specific with his directions and said that's just kind of a supply closet thing. And then you see the 2 passages. He's already told you that the one on the east is not where you need to go. It's the northerly one that's the important one, or probably where she ended up. And another feature of this room is that there is a large metal grate in the center of the room, like quite big, probably about, I don't know, maybe 10 feet in diameter, maybe a little bigger. And if you just kind of peer down there really quickly, you'll see it leads to some kind of like crawl space that's even beneath this space. And then also along the walls of the room, there are several circular metal grates that are kind of up high on the walls. So I guess that's all the stuff you'll see at a glance. What do?
So I think that Andrew's nervousness has been infectious, and I am feeling nervous. And I had bloodless wrapped around my midsection, and I've started to uncoil it and kind of get one of each of the bladed ends in my hands. And I take the torch and start looking at these grates that are on the walls, and I'm looking to see if they're like connected, or like what these grates are about. Like if I can tell it what purpose they serve or what function they have.
I think that satisfies the trigger for Discern Realities. Go ahead and roll plus wisdom.
All right. So I'm rolling my 2d6. I got a 10.
Awesome. You get 3 questions from the list. You can spend them right away if you want to ask me right now, or you can ask them and we can do the scene a little bit more, and then you can kind of keep asking them as we go.
Yeah, I'll ask one now, and then I think I'll hold the rest for another instance. But in regard to these grates, what here's not what it appears to be?
That's a great question. So the little grates, I think you would probably assume that they are some kind of ventilation. So they would kind of go up to the surface in some way. And indeed, there might be small ventilation holes. But in fact, the grates actually seem like the entrances and exits of a little crawl space that seems to go around the perimeter of the room and possibly down the corridors as well. But it's like a little crawl space, roughly 3 or 4 feet in diameter. And it's unusual, right? To have this like strange little crawl space that like runs parallel with the corridor.
It is strange. I give that, just a kind of a puzzled look. I'm not sure what that's, because it's not secret enough to be a secret passageway.
Right, yeah.
It's strange that they would have this parallel passageway. But I'm going to walk over to the storage room that had been described previously. And I'm going to open that room up and use as my second question, what here is useful or valuable to me?
Good question. So it is, as Andrew said, it's just a storage thing. You see a number of crates kind of stacked up. There are barrels, rolls of cloth, a number of dried goods and rations and things. I think what you'll actually find that's pretty interesting is you'll find a sack of like tools, different kinds of tools. I don't want to precisely define them for a reason I'm about to say, but basically it looks like a little sack of like tools that, maybe were left behind by the people who originally dug these tunnels or, the people who do maintenance in the tunnels. But sort of out of character, this is going to count as adventuring gear. So you can put 5 uses of adventuring gear in your equipment.
Okay, good. You always need adventuring gear on something like this.
You bet. And whenever you want to use something from the adventuring gear, just say I'm using an adventuring gear and then tell me what you pull out of the pack, right? Like if you're in a situation where it'd be helpful to have a little hatchet, just mark an adventuring gear and you have a hatchet.
Okay, great. And then I'll close that storage room up and I'll start to proceed north. And I want to know, what should I be on the lookout for? My third question from Discern Realities.
Yeah. One, because you had kind of mentioned that like before you were particularly focused on those grates that are kind of high up on the seat or on the wall, right? You hear something inside the crawl space a little bit ahead. I think you probably get down the corridor, maybe 100, 200 paces, right? And you hear something indeed crawling around in the crawl space. What do you do?
I'm going to... Do these grates open?
They do, yeah. They're on a hinge that goes both directions.
Okay. Then I'm going to open it up and get a look at whatever's in there, assuming it's further down and not like immediately on the other side of the grate.
Right, yeah. So these little grates are a little high up on the wall, and so you'll have to kind of, you can use your weapon or something like that to kind of lift up the thing, but you'll otherwise have to give yourself a little boost. It looks like they're maybe not meant to be easy for people to get into.
I see. Then I'll use one use of adventuring gear, pull out a shovel, and kind of prop it open with a shovel.
Oh, nice. I like that. Yeah. So you're kind of like propping it open how, I guess?
Well, if it opens outward and upward, then I would take the flat end of the shovel, pin it up against the ceiling, and then prop the back end of the shovel against the wall so that it's open.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. And the corridor's pretty narrow, so that makes sense. Awesome. Yeah. If you do that, you can easily you can kind of boost up there and take a look. Let's say you boost up there, and I'll just tell you that like, you definitely hear something up ahead. It's pretty dark. I assume you're just going by the ambient light in your torch because you wouldn't want to put your torch in this tiny crawl space, right? But whatever it is, you've got a little bit of time to maybe try to suss out what it is. Like, what do you do at this point?
I think I probably had to make enough noise getting up here, and there's light coming from me that I'm not getting any element of surprise here, so I'm just going to try and call out to whoever or whatever it is and see if it's a person. I don't want to kill a monk.
Yeah.
Is someone there? Someone down there? Hello?
I think this might count as triggering Discern Realities. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so.
Because you're trying to figure out it's a way of sort of studying what's going on because you're kind of trying to call out to it, right?
Sure.
In any case, the questions make sense in this context.
Definitely.
Let's have another Discern Realities roll, and you get to add a +1 for following up on the last one.
Right. I got an 8 total.
Awesome. You get one question.
What should I be on the lookout for?
You call out, and you can't quite see it, but it definitely responds in its way. You hear scratching. You hear a strange sort of like muffled breathing, kind of a guttural breathing. I don't know. Let me just do it. Sort of a but it's still far enough away to where you can't quite see what it is. And you're also not in any immediate danger either. What do you do?
But it's coming this way.
Unclear.
Okay. I think I will back out of the grate, leave it propped open, and prepare myself for whatever it is, assuming it's coming this way. If it doesn't come this way or sound like it's coming this way, then I'll proceed further on.
Indeed. I mentioned that these little grates were spaced at intervals along the high wall, right? And I think there is another one of these little grates a little bit further down the corridor, and whatever it is, the thing slips out of that grate, so it's behind you. But it doesn't have an element of surprise or anything. Like you hear the grate, kind of the rusty creak of it as it swings, and you see whatever it is like drop down to the ground, right? And it's I'd say maybe 15, 20 paces away. But what you see in your torchlight is a long-limbed humanoid, pale, rubbery skin. It seems to have eyes that are like milky white, like it's blind, but otherwise has, it's got feet and arms and hands and stuff, but it's just like a nude, slick, hairless, white creature. And it's loping right towards you. What do you do?
I toss the torch between me and it and get my weapon in both hands. And if it keeps coming at me and seems like it's going to attack, I'll cut it down.
Yeah, just describe that. Let's say it does. It's coming for you, and its noise making is getting more frantic, like as it like kind of like quickly picks up the pace. I mean, it's not very far away to begin with. I mean, so yeah, it lunges. What do you do?
Yeah, so I've tossed the torch, and in that light, the light casting upward from the ground, all shadows beneath its limbs and face, but I'm in deeper, darker shadow, and Bloodless goes singing out, wraps around it, and then I take the other end and go for a cut around its neck.
Nice. That triggers hack and slash. Go ahead and roll that plus strength.
Okay. I can't believe it. I got a 6 total.
I'll take the fiction here. You swing Bloodless out. You throw it out in an attempt to grab the creature, and that works. And you rush forward with the other end of Bloodless, which you said is like kind of a sharpened spike thing, right?
Yeah.
And you rush forward to try to stab it. But the creature is really, really slippery. I mentioned it has kind of like a rubbery flesh, and indeed it's also like a slick flesh. It quickly like slips out of the chain and it just like pounces. It like slams on top of you, pins you down on the ground, and your hand that's holding the other end of Bloodless, the creature just like opens its like sharp toothy maw and just bears down and just clamps onto your wrist, and you feel its teeth quickly scissoring through your gloves and your flesh, and pretty soon the bone. We will pick it up next time. Well, so listeners, we hope you enjoyed Dungeon World Basics 01. If you want to get in touch with us, the best way to do that is going to be on Twitter. My Twitter is @GauntletRPG. I'm really active there. We're also on G+. We have a community in G+. If you're on G+, just go to the community section and search for The Gauntlet. You'll find us there. We have Patreon. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Yeah, so those are the best things to do. We also have a website, which I recommend checking out too, called gauntlet-rpg.com. David, thanks so much.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.